Michelle Bright was born on June 2, 1981, in the small rural town of Gulgong, Australia. A quiet, close-knit community of just 2,500 people. Tucked away from the bustle of major cities, Gulgong was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and unfamiliar faces stood out. Outsiders rarely came through. Michelle lived there with her parents and two older brothers. She attended the local school, had a wide circle of friends, and was known for her vibrant spirit and kindness. She loved playing basketball, but more than anything, she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her love for animals was so strong, she even had a horse of her own. Michelle also talked often of wanting a big family someday. 6 children, to be exact. By 1999, at 17 years old, Michelle was focused on her future. She poured herself into her studies, hoping top grades would help her gain entry into veterinary school. On the evening of February 26th, Michelle had plans to attend a friend's birthday party. The night was mapped out. She would join the celebration at her friend's house and later spend the night at another friend's place, since her own home was a bit too far to walk back safely after dark. That evening, her mother drove her to the party, as Michelle didn't yet have a car. Just before getting out of the vehicle, she turned to her mom and said, "See you in the morning." They exchanged quick goodbyes, neither realizing it would be the last time they'd speak. The next morning, when Michelle's mother woke up, she noticed her daughter still wasn't home. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Michelle was likely just sleeping in after a late night out. But as the hours passed, concern set in. Michelle didn't own a mobile phone, so her mother began calling around, reaching out to her daughter's friends to see where she might be. That's when she learned something unsettling. Michelle had left the party around 12:30 a.m., accepting a ride from a couple who offered to drop her off in the town center. From there, it was only a short walk to the friend's house where she planned to spend the night. But Michelle never arrived, and that short walk through a quiet town in the middle of the night would mark the beginning of a haunting mystery, one that would shake the community of Gulgong to its core. As the hours dragged on with no word from Michelle, her mother's concern deepened into full-blown panic. Still clinging to hope, she called more friends, thinking maybe Michelle had changed plans and stayed with someone else for the night. But each call brought the same answer. No one had seen Michelle after the party. No one knew where she was. By the time she'd exhausted every name on the list, it had already been several hours, and not a single trace of her daughter had surfaced. Left with no other options, Michelle's mother went to the police. But instead of help, she was met with resistance. Officers at the local station brushed off her concerns, suggesting Michelle was probably just out with friends or had run away. Despite her pleas, explaining that her daughter wasn't the type to disappear, that something felt terribly wrong, the police refused to launch a search. Frustrated and terrified, Michelle's mother and her family took matters into their own hands. They canvassed the town, knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, retraced every possible route Michelle could have taken that night. For days they searched, but found nothing. Then came the evening of March 2nd. A man was out walking his dog along a quiet road just outside of Gulgong. The sun had started to set when something in the tall grass near an old railway line caught his attention. He stopped, took a closer look, and froze. It was a body. He called police immediately. When officers arrived, they recognized her at once. It was Michelle Bright. Her clothing was partially missing, and her bra had been torn off. Her school bag was found nearby in the grass, but there were no obvious clues left behind. The site was quiet, undisturbed, and chillingly close to home, less than half a mile from where Michelle lived. Hidden by thick grass, her body had been just out of view for days. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. Michelle had been brutally assaulted and strangled. Her body bore multiple bruises, consistent with a violent struggle. In her hand, investigators found a few strands of hair, possibly torn from her attacker during the assault. But any hope that those hairs might help identify the killer was quickly dashed. No usable DNA could be extracted from them, and the scene yielded no other biological evidence. Whoever had taken Michelle's life had left almost nothing behind. A vibrant 17-year-old girl had vanished during a short walk through her own hometown, and now she was gone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. With the discovery of Michelle Bright's body, the case was no longer a missing person. It was now a murder investigation. And only then did police begin to treat it with the urgency it had always deserved. Their first step was to retrace Michelle's final known movements, starting with the birthday party she had attended on the night of February 26th. Forensic experts estimated that Michelle had likely been killed that same night, meaning someone who was at the party or someone nearby might have seen something, or worse, been involved. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been there. According to all accounts, the night had been uneventful. There were no arguments, no drama, and no signs of trouble. Michelle had been in good spirits, laughing and chatting with friends. No one saw her get into any kind of disagreement. When it came time to leave, she accepted a ride from a couple who offered to drop her in the town center. Police quickly located the couple. They confirmed Michelle's story. They had dropped her off on the main street in Gulgong, where she planned to walk a short distance to her friend's house for the night. After dropping her off, they said they drove away and didn't see where she went next. But Michelle's friend confirmed what her mother had feared. Michelle never arrived. That left investigators with two possibilities. Either she was attacked before reaching her friend's house, or she had changed her mind and tried to walk home instead. Still, there was a problem. The route from the main street to her friend's house was well traveled, and no one reported hearing screams or a struggle. Investigators doubted that someone could have attacked Michelle in the middle of town without being noticed. It led them to a chilling theory. Michelle may have known her attacker. Perhaps someone offered her a ride, someone she trusted enough to get into a car with, and instead of taking her where she intended to go, they drove her to a secluded location just outside of town, where her body would later be found. Michelle's family strongly supported that theory. They insisted she would never get into a car with a stranger. And in a small town like Gulgong, where everyone knew everyone, outsiders stood out. If someone unfamiliar had approached her, she would have recognized that immediately. In the following weeks, investigators continued their search for answers. They interviewed more residents, checked alibis, and began collecting DNA samples from potential suspects, even though the killer had left behind no usable biological evidence. That fact wasn't made public. Detectives quietly hoped that as DNA technology advanced, they might eventually be able to extract a genetic profile from the hair strands found in Michelle's hand, or from other items of evidence that had, for now, yielded nothing. The investigation was moving, but the clock was ticking, and the killer was still out there. From the earliest days of the investigation, detectives began building a list of potential suspects. One of the first names to surface was Michelle's ex-boyfriend. The two had recently broken up, and according to their mutual friends, he hadn't taken it well. He was reportedly upset about the split, angry even. But despite the emotional motive, there was no physical evidence linking him to Michelle's murder. Investigators also couldn't place him near the route Michelle was walking that night. Without proof he'd had the opportunity, the lead went cold. Another local man also caught the attention of police, not because of what he did, but because of how he reacted. He seemed excessively distraught over Michelle's death, despite the fact that they barely knew each other. His reaction was unsettling. But again, like the ex-boyfriend, there was nothing tying him to the crime. Then, something odd happened. A few days after Michelle's body was discovered, a family member visited the scene to pay their respects. As they walked through the grass where she had been found, they spotted something shining in the dirt. One of Michelle's earrings. It didn't make sense. The area had already been thoroughly searched by police. Had they missed it? Or was it something more sinister? Investigators considered the possibility that the killer had taken the earring with them, and then perhaps returned later to dispose of evidence quietly, hoping it would go unnoticed. The mystery only deepened. Over the following months, detectives compiled a list of 14 individuals who stood out in some way. But connecting any of them to the murder proved nearly impossible. With no usable DNA and no eyewitnesses, the case remained frustratingly out of reach. Most of the suspects agreed to provide voluntary DNA samples, all except one. A 23-year-old man named Mark refused. That decision raised a red flag and prompted investigators to take a much closer look at him. What they found was deeply troubling. Shortly after Michelle's murder, police discovered that Mark had been stalking a local woman for 8 months. On one occasion, he even broke into her home. The behavior escalated when he was later accused of harassing a woman in a nearby town. According to her report, Mark followed her down the street, eventually catching up to her and touching her inappropriately. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges in that case, but to detectives working Michelle's case, it was alarming. Then came another revealing detail. Mark had been in the same class as Michelle's older brother. That meant he could have known the Bright family personally, even Michelle herself. When questioned, Mark claimed he had been in the town center on the night Michelle disappeared, but said he was home by 1:15 a.m. That timeline, if true, would make it almost impossible for him to have committed the crime. There wouldn't have been enough time to abduct Michelle, drive her to field, and carry out the murder. But investigators weren't convinced. When they spoke with Mark's wife, her account didn't line up. She said she wasn't sure when he got home, and in fact, suggested it could have been much later than 1:15 a.m. It wasn't proof. But it was another piece of a puzzle that was beginning to form, and Mark was now at the center of it. The growing suspicion around Mark prompted investigators to take a bold next step. They obtained a warrant and installed a wiretap in his home. What they heard only deepened their concerns. Privately, Mark's wife had doubts of her own. On multiple occasions, she could be heard pressing him for answers, asking if he had anything to do with Michelle Bright's murder. Her questions were persistent, even emotional, suggesting she herself wasn't convinced of his innocence. Eventually, she managed to convince him to cooperate with the police and provide a DNA sample. But just one day before his scheduled appointment, Mark crashed his car into a tree. The circumstances were suspicious enough that investigators considered it might have been a suicide attempt, possibly to avoid what was coming. Still, a few days later, Mark handed over his DNA sample after all. But once again, science hit a wall. Despite Mark's increasingly erratic behavior, police were still missing the one crucial element: the killer's DNA. Without that, or any other concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest him. Suspicion wasn't enough. The case stagnated. Over the next year, detectives continued interviewing new witnesses, exploring other leads, and revisiting the growing list of suspects. But time and again, they were met with dead ends. For Michelle's grieving family, life in Gulgong became unbearable. They were convinced the person responsible for her death was someone local, perhaps someone they passed by on the street or stood behind in line at the shops. By 2000, unable to bear the weight of that uncertainty, they moved away, leaving behind the only home Michelle had ever known. That same year, a reward of $100,000 was offered for information leading to the killer's capture. It drew in new tips and fresh attention, but none of the leads panned out. In 2002, investigators took another shot in the dark. They traveled to the UK to conduct further analysis on Michelle's belongings, hoping modern labs there might uncover foreign DNA overlooked in earlier testing. But once again, nothing. The case was reopened multiple times in the years that followed. In 2009, in a desperate push for answers, authorities increased the reward to $500,000, the largest in the state's history. The money generated a wave of interest. Hundreds of tips, theories, and phone calls flooded in. But none of them led to the truth. Then, in 2019, 20 years after Michelle Bright was killed, the case was reopened yet again. Despite advances in forensic technology, investigators were still unable to locate any foreign DNA on Michelle's body or clothing. It was a devastating reality. The killer had left no traceable evidence behind. With DNA no longer a viable path forward, detectives returned to the original list of suspects, now trimmed to just 5 names. After meticulously reevaluating each of them, they narrowed the list down to 2. And for the first time in years, they had a renewed focus, and possibly a path toward finally getting justice for Michelle. Among the 2 remaining suspects in the Michelle Bright murder investigation, one name rose to the top. Craig Rumsby, a 56-year-old man with a deeply troubling past. At the time of Michelle's death in 1999, Craig lived just 2 houses away from her family. That alone raised concern. But what drew even more suspicion was that Craig abruptly moved to Sydney just 2 weeks after the murder. His background was far from clean. Craig had a lengthy criminal history, including multiple arrests for indecent exposure, harassment, and other sexually motivated offenses. He was also known to be involved in petty theft and other illegal activities. But perhaps most disturbingly, Craig had already been linked to a prior assault, one that took place in Gulgong just a year before Michelle was killed. In that case, a young woman had returned home after a party and was sitting on her front porch, waiting for her boyfriend. Without warning, a man, later identified as Craig, approached her, struck her, and attempted to sexually assault her. The attack ended abruptly when the woman's boyfriend arrived, scaring Craig off. The woman reported the incident to police, but ultimately, no charges were filed. Despite the severity of the attack, her testimony alone wasn't considered strong enough to guarantee a conviction. Faced with the risk of losing in court, the authorities let it go. Craig walked free. To the investigators now revisiting Michelle's case, it was a glaring red flag. Craig had the proximity, the history, and the pattern of violence. They were convinced he was their man, but without physical evidence or DNA, they needed a confession. So detectives made a bold, high-stakes decision. They would set up an elaborate undercover sting. Knowing Craig's criminal leanings, police created a fake crime syndicate, posing as members of a serious underworld network, one with deep connections, including supposed insiders within law enforcement. The organization claimed to be moving large sums of money and was recruiting one more member for their growing operation. Craig took the bait. Intrigued and drawn to the perceived power and promise of protection, he agreed to join. Over the next several months, undercover officers worked to gain his trust, drawing him deeper into their fictitious world. They told Craig that their group was like a family, but with one condition: complete honesty. "If you've got skeletons in your closet," they told him, "we need to know. Because if we can't trust you, you'll never be part of the big jobs." To maintain the illusion, the group carried out a series of crimes. The police never disclosed details, but it's believed some were staged events or minor thefts meant to appear real. Whatever it took to build credibility and keep Craig engaged. The operation dragged on for nearly a year, and then, with trust secured, investigators decided it was time to move into the next phase, one that would either bring the truth into the light or risk losing their only shot at solving one of New South Wales's most haunting unsolved murders. The undercover operation was now entering its most critical stage. By this point, Craig had been fully drawn into the fictitious criminal network. The undercover team decided it was time to apply pressure, not directly, but subtly and psychologically. They hinted that the police were reopening an old murder case and that Craig's name had surfaced. It was vague enough to avoid raising suspicion, but clear enough to send a message. During a conversation with one of the gang members, Craig nervously said, "I hope they won't question me about the murder of Michelle Bright." He quickly tried to deflect suspicion by adding, "She was like a sister to me. I knew her since she was a baby." But the investigators didn't let up. Shortly after, another operative, this time posing as a corrupt detective on the gang's payroll, met with Craig. He told him that investigators from a small town had reactivated an old case and were actively closing in on him. It was designed to feel like inside information, something only a connected criminal syndicate could offer. And then came phase 3 of the operation. The real police held a press conference, announcing a record-breaking $1 million reward for any information leading to Michelle Bright's killer. It was the largest reward in the history of New South Wales, and it made headlines across the country. The move was a strategic blow meant to destabilize Craig emotionally and make the pressure feel real. The very same day, Craig responded to a police department social media post about the reward with a public comment. "It's so sad that they haven't caught her killer. Michelle was like a sister to me. I feel sorry for the family." But behind the scenes, the undercover team was preparing to bring the operation to a head. Craig was invited to meet the gang's elusive boss, a figure he'd never seen before. That boss was actually an experienced undercover officer brought in for the final confrontation. During the meeting, the boss told Craig that the police were onto him, not for one, but for 2 separate cases. His involvement posed a serious threat to the entire organization, and if there was anything Craig needed to come clean about, now was the time. Still, Craig denied everything. But then, the boss pulled out a manila folder, thick with fabricated police materials from the Michelle Bright case. Inside were case files, reports, and a photo of Craig's old car, the same one he'd owned back in 1999. The undercover detective pointed out that shortly after Craig had spoken to police by phone in '99, his car was found burned, a suspicious move that had always remained in the case file. He leaned in, saying investigators had gathered enough to make an arrest at any moment. That was the turning point. Faced with what appeared to be incontrovertible evidence, and under the illusion that a powerful crime syndicate was willing to protect him if he told the truth, Craig's facade finally cracked. And then, he began to talk. Craig's confession came in fragments, disjointed and soaked in alcohol-induced haze. He told the undercover gang boss that on the night of Michelle's murder, he had driven into Gulgong, visited a friend, and then wandered into the town center. There, he stopped at a local bar and chatted briefly with the owner. He believed he left his car nearby and began walking, but said his memory beyond that point was blurry due to heavy drinking. Still, amid the fog, Craig admitted he killed Michelle Bright. But for the detectives, that vague admission wasn't enough. It lacked substance. It lacked proof. So the gang leader made him an offer. Go back to the scene of the crime with a few trusted members, jog his memory, and afterward, they would take him to the airport and help him vanish. Craig agreed. At the remote stretch near the railway tracks, where Michelle's body was found 2 decades earlier, Craig walked through the grass and reenacted the crime. He described how he dragged Michelle off the roadside, trying to conceal her body in the tall brush. He said he couldn't remember if he had assaulted her, but he remembered removing parts of her clothing. Crucially, he mentioned the broken clasp on her bra, a detail that had never been released publicly. It was something only the killer would know. Then came another admission. Craig confessed to an attempted sexual assault on a woman a year before Michelle's death, the very case where he had once been named a suspect, but never charged. He described how he struck the woman and tried to attack her until her boyfriend arrived and scared him off. The details he shared matched the victim's account exactly, confirming the truth of his confession. The trap was now complete. After Craig's walkthrough of the crime, the gang members escorted him to the airport as promised. But this time, real police were waiting. 20 years after Michelle Bright's murder, Craig was arrested and charged. He was taken into custody, where he would remain as prosecutors prepared for trial. The trial, a long-awaited reckoning. The trial began in 2023, with Craig facing 2 major charges: the murder of Michelle Bright and the attempted assault from the previous year. Despite his recorded confession and the damning details he'd given, Craig pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that the confession had been made under psychological pressure. They claimed Craig was manipulated, cornered by a fake criminal gang, and terrified for his safety. The confession, they insisted, was false and coerced. But the prosecution pushed back hard. Craig hadn't been threatened. He had voluntarily joined the group, built trust over time, and had every opportunity to walk away. More importantly, they pointed to his intimate knowledge of the crime, like the broken bra clasp and how Michelle's body was concealed, as proof that his confession was genuine. Their theory was straightforward. Craig, a neighbor Michelle likely knew and trusted, had offered her a ride or walked her home. It was late and she had no reason to be suspicious. But at some point, likely on the outskirts of town, he turned on her. He attacked, dragged her off the road, and left her in the grass near the old railway line. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Michelle's family sat through every moment, listening as years of anguish and silence were finally given voice in a courtroom. When the jury returned its verdict, they found Craig guilty on both counts. The woman he had assaulted years earlier testified again, only this time, justice would not slip away. The judge sentenced Craig to 32 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 24 years. That means the earliest he could be released would be in his late 70s. A family forever changed. For Michelle's loved ones, the verdict was a long-awaited moment of truth, bittersweet and heavy with grief. Her mother, father, and brothers had carried the weight of her loss for 2 decades. 6 years after Michelle's death, her parents divorced, unable to bear the shared sorrow. Her mother's life never fully recovered. Her father and brothers blamed themselves, haunted by the thought that they hadn't protected her. Now, at last, there was some measure of peace. The man who stole Michelle's future would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the family, though forever broken by tragedy, could finally begin to heal. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.